Thank you. Thank you all for attending this session in such large numbers. It speaks about Gandhi and his life and influence. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce two distinguished panelists today's discussion will take place on. To my left is Miss Manvitha Singamsetty. She is a Ph.D. candidate at Ottawa University, devoting her dissertation to the Gandhian principles and their practical relevance in multicultural societies all over the world. She has been to many countries, worked on many curriculum, worked on 300 workshops, dealt with the federal, provincial and regional governments in many, many countries, all related to the Gandhian principle of non-violence and how it relates to the harmony of multicultural societies. I cannot think of a better youthful panelist than Manvitha Singamsetty. Please welcome her. On my right is a very distinguished academician who has been associated with Carleton University for more than half a century and has contributed to its development both as a distinguished alumni as well as a distinguished professor. Much more relevant for today's discussion is Professor Humar's seminal contribution to Ottawa society in relation to Gandhi's principles and his work. He is the founding member of Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council in Ottawa, and he has been responsible through his dedicated, unstinting work in having the statue of Mahatma Gandhi on the premises of Carleton University with the association of the Government of India, which contributed the statue itself. Much more important, he has made this Gandhi Peace Council a charitable organization. Means any donations that you give to this association or Peace Council are tax deductible. And that's a very significant development. That means the government of Canada has recognized the importance of Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council and its work. On October 2nd, our beloved Jim Watson, the mayor of Ottawa, has declared, will be declaring I suppose, October 2nd as Gandhi Day in Ottawa. This will be the first time, but it will not be the last time in the cities of Canada. On October 5th, I will let Professor Humar expand on it. There is an important celebration called Gandhi Jayanti by Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council. And my personal request to all of you to participate in it as a tribute. It's not enough to say Gandhi is a great man. It's not at all enough he has done this, that. What can you do about it? That is the relevant question. As Gandhi said, change yourself before you ask the world to be changed. Start with yourself. So let's keep that. I would invite Manvitha to make a presentation. It will be for 30 minutes, followed by Professor Humar, another 30 minutes, followed by Q&A for 30 minutes before someone pulls us out. I would request the members of the audience to be very, very brief in their questions, not more than 30 seconds, so that the panelists could respond to all your questions as much as possible. With that, without much ado, I request Manvitha to let her know of her wonderful work on Gandhi and his principles. And she is going to talk to us on Gandhian environmentalism and how it affects the various societies today. And Professor Humar is going to talk to us with a focus on Gandhi's contribution and relevance to the world at large. So these two combined, with your question and answers, I'm sure it will be a wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Slide change. Out of deference to Professor Humar, she would yield the floor to Professor Humar. So shall it be.
No, the final word has to go to an expert. Manvitha is our expert. I am an engineering professor who knows much less than Gandhi than Manvitha does. Well, thank you, Professor Nanduri Rao. As you mentioned, Mahatma Gandhi's contribution to this world is unique and universal. And we, therefore, in Canada, were very proud to be able to form a Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council in 2006. It was subsequently recognized as a federally incorporated body and a charitable organization. And in 2011, we brought a statue of Gandhi with the assistance of the High Commission of India, and the statue was installed at Carleton in a beautiful setting. So every year on October 2, the birth anniversary of Gandhi, we have a ceremony at the statue. In addition, we have what is called an endowed Gandhi lecture, MK Gandhi lecture, endowed at Carleton University. And this lecture takes place just around October 2 every year. This year is special. This year is the 150th anniversary of Gandhi's birth. He was born in 1869. And therefore, Mayor has agreed to proclaim October 2 as Gandhi Day in the city of Ottawa. On October 5, our endowed lecture takes place at Carleton University from 2 p.m. At 2 p.m. we garland the statue and then we have the lecture. And you are all invited. In fact, Gandhi's website is very simple to remember. www.gandhig.ca. Gandhi plus J-I, which is an honorific. So gandhig.ca. And all of the details will come on the website shortly. So you're all invited. This lecture is open to public. The garlanding ceremony at the statue is open to all. So with that, let me try and do what I was supposed to do, is to talk about the relevance of Gandhi in contemporary law. What is the significant thing about the world today? What defines it? What ails it? And there are two things that I can think of. At the advent of the 21st century, we are witness to a world mired in violence, bloodshed, and destruction. Violence between nation states is common, but violence has now penetrated insidiously among individuals, groups, and communities. The influence of perverted religious passions stalks our society, spreading the fire of intolerance, bigotry, bloodshed, and wars. Sectarian and communal violence goes all over the world. The conflicts are bloodier, and the parties more intransigent, less willing to resolve their differences. And you can see events happening in the Middle East these days and elsewhere, where it's very easy to see 1 million people killed in, say, in Syria, for example. The development of the lethal weapons of destruction in our times has made the landscape even gloomier. There are currently enough nuclear armaments to kill the entire human race 10 times over. There can be no victor in a modern war. This ultimate threat of nuclear annihilation is bound to lead to a profound sense of despair, mistrust, alienation, and sense of hopelessness that we see permeating all our society, among individuals, among communities. That's where Gandhi's message is relevant today, and I'll speak to it in my presentation here. There is an additional potential source of self-destruction that threatens our civilization. This includes the threat of resource depletion and environmental degradation. It has now become abundantly clear that the existing lifestyle of humans cannot be sustained for a long, and resources of the planet Earth are not enough to sustain that lifestyle. First, there is the rapidly growing population. According to United Nations, by 2050, the population of Earth will be more than 9 billion. With the existing levels of consumption that we have, and growing levels of consumption in the developing world, it's hard for this planet to sustain that kind of population. In fact, we need 5 to 6 times this planet to sustain the demands that our population, with its growing rate of consumption, will impose on the environment and on the resources of the earth. There is the increasing energy use, depletion of non-renewable resources, spreading of chemicals, and the resulting degradation of the environment and global warming. Perhaps the most perverting force working against a sustainable future is the society's insatiable hunger for material comfort. Yesterday's wants have become today's needs, and today's wants are destined to become tomorrow's needs. Unfortunately, this desire for luxuries is not limited just to the developed world, but extends also to many underdeveloped and developing nations, where abject poverty often exists side by side with affluence. This is another area in which Gandhi's message, some 100 years ago that he gave, is still relevant today. And Manvitha is going to focus on that part and tell you more about it, but I'll try and come back to the torture that our world is facing with its bloodshed, its war, and its atrocities. So in the face of impending peril towards civilization, both because of the warfare, bloodshed, and also because of resource depletion and environmental degradation, Gandhi's ideas and ideals have become increasingly relevant. The relevance of Gandhi has been eloquently expressed by Martin Luther King. At the end of his visit to India in 1959, Dr. King observed during a press conference, "If humanity is to progress, Gandhi is inescapable. He lived, thought, and acted inspired by the vision of a humanity evolving toward a world of peace and harmony, and we may ignore him at our own risk." So the dialogue around Gandhi's contemporary relevance revolves around 4 basic questions, which I am going to address one at a time. These questions are, first, where does Gandhi's significance lie? Is it in his inspiration as a religious and moral leader, or is it in his development of practical political tactics? Second question, to what extent Gandhi's techniques of non-violence inseparable from and therefore dependent on his moral and religious principles? And the third, are Gandhi's techniques of universal significance, or were they historically limited to the special case of India's right for independence against Britain? And finally, Is Gandhi's nonviolent resistance a desirable or a useful tactic for achieving world peace or avoiding nuclear catastrophe today or nation wars today? To the foregoing, of course, you must add the relevance of Gandhi's ideas and ideals related to the protection of the environment, which Manvitha is going to cover. So let's deal with the first question. Morality and politics. Was he a moral leader, a saint, or a politician? Gandhi was first and foremost an activist. He made no pretense of being a philosopher. It would therefore appear that his greatest relevance is in the development of a practical political tactic. Now, politics is defined by Gandhi in a different way. Usually, politics means how to attain, acquire power and retain it. That's what politics usually meant. In his words, in his thought, politics was a means of serving the people. And his definition of politics was therefore different. And morality is part of politics according to him. So politics of morality, not politics of war. Right now we have politics which is imbued with war and bloodshed. Gandhi also said the other thing, that the tactic that he was using for his resistance to oppression, but for the greater good, for achieving social justice for all. And his political ideas are founded on the four pillars of truth: non-violence, service, and Swaraj. And the instrument that he used was known popularly as Satyagraha, a word that he coined, which literally means Satya means truth and Agra is insistence or force. So it's a truth force. What it meant was the insistence of holding on to truth, which Gandhi called truth force, was his means of achieving the state of truth in politics. And religion or morality was the guiding light in walking on that path of truth. For Gandhi, politics was not the accumulation of power, but a medium of serving the masses. Religion for him was not a means to simply subscribing to a faith or a creed. Instead, it was a universal concept which contained within itself truth and righteousness. Gandhi believed that truth was God, and hence a religious person should be truthful in his thoughts, words, and actions. Gandhi believed in being truthful not only to his own people, but also to his adversaries. He never hid his actions or his intentions, always wanted to avoid unnecessary conflict, always sought compromise. He would register protest only if a compromise could not be reached. And here too, he informed the opponents what form of protest would it take. So what is important is, Gandhi said that if you are pursuing a goal or an aim, it should be based on truth. Because normally politics is about deception. Politics is about hiding the truth. Politics is about lying. For him, truth was the most important one. So if he flouts a law, it should be something which was an oppressive law, which is an unjust law. He asked all his followers to say, never flout a law. You must obey the law. Only if you obey the proper laws, then people will listen to you when you flout an unjust law. And therefore, if you look at his example of Dandi March, the famous Salt March in 1931, he was protesting against the imposition of a tax on the production of salt by the British government, which everybody, common man, was doing in his own time, the seashore. But what he did was he told the governor what exactly the protest form will take, when it will take, and what we will be doing. And he said there should be no violence at all. So his followers, the Satyagrahis, who were trained previously, they walked, they marched, and they were beaten, they were arrested, they were put into prison. Nobody resisted, nobody raised a hand. Now what did it do? It aroused sympathy among the general population for these Satyagrahis who are selfless, who are prepared to suffer, take the suffering on themselves. And the whole population of India rose against the government for that issue. That itself was sufficient force on the government to reverse the salt law. That's one example of one of his resistance movements. So Gandhi's emphasis on morality in all actions, including political action, and on integrating religious and politics has led to the argument whether he was a saint or a politician. True that the moral values and religious concepts of Gandhi have universal applications in the lives of individuals, promoting mutual understanding, love, kindness, and compassion. But beyond individuals, Gandhi sought welfare for all, or so-called Sarvodaya, welfare of all. That's what that term means. It is obvious, therefore, that he was a political activist, but with the difference, steadfast in the belief that all action must be based on truthfulness and honesty. So that's where his role of morality in politics comes. All politics is the instrument which is necessary to run the society, but it should be imbued with morality. Gandhi's biggest and most unique contribution to political philosophy has been non-violence. Political history abounds with instances of revolts, rebellions, wars, instruments of achieving political aims. These are now, people use them as instruments of achieving political aims. For example, the ongoing wars that are going on in the Middle East between Palestine and Israel, for years and years, they have not yet been able to get what they wanted. So violence has not done the job. There are other wars going on, Yemen and Saudi Arabia fighting each other. However, despite all the bloodshed and war through decades, none of the conflicts have been resolved. So violence is not a solution for resolving conflicts. So Gandhi's emphasis on non-violence demonstrated that victory for a cause can be won without the opponent feeling defeated. Non-violence is the only true way of finding lasting solutions to complex problems. Gandhi adopted this method to fight against the mightiest powers of that time. Such an approach helped in involving the entire population in the goal of getting independence. Thus, he was able to make independence movement the struggle of the entire nation rather than the fight of a few individuals. Every struggle based on the principle of non-violence has had to find its own methods. Gandhi worked out the technique of satyagraha. It was a struggle for rightful cause through non-violent resistance and non-cooperation. As I said, satyagraha means truth and agraha means firmness or insistence. And we could call it truth force. But truth force must be based on truth, love and non-violence. A satyagrahi must be ready to suffer himself, but not to inflict suffering on another, not to raise a hand, not to wield an arm. Many have argued that Gandhi was successful because his adversaries were the British, who had a sense of justice, the gentle people. But if he was facing a less democratic regime like that of Hitler or Stalin, perhaps his non-violence will not succeed. That was the third question. While there may be some grain of truth in this, it must be realized the British were not always just or gentle. Under their rule in India, people not only suffered seriously in foul prisons and prison camps, but literally had their skulls cracked in beating with steel-shod bamboo sticks, and were shot while demonstrating. In a more famous and grave case, the shooting at Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar, two Indians holding peaceful meeting were without warning mowed down in a hail of bullets. According to Hunter Commission, 379 people were killed and 1,137 were wounded. Unarmed people inside a compound where they cannot escape, they were hailed down, mowed down a hail of bullets. There are in fact instances where non-violent resistance movement has been successful in facing non-democratic governments. Because the question is whether it will be successful under Hitler or Stalin or other non-democratic government which do not care about the suffering of the Satyagrahis. I can quote one example. In the mid-1980s, a popular non-violent movement took place in Philippines. It was to oust the corrupt dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Thousands of ordinary people sat down in front of tanks to prevent them from reaching the rebels. They did not deter even when threatened with firing. And in 3 years, Ferdinand Marcos had to step down and escape from the country. The third question that I'm going to deal with is the universal appeal of non-violent resistance. It's not just confined to the case of India and India seeking independence. Violence has been entrenched in our culture for a long time, and much of the present structure of the society still depends on force. Gandhi was among the first to show that non-violent resistance could be useful in securing the just right of a group in face of the denial of such rights by the state, or a dictator, or an occupying force. The instrument of non-violent resistance was a humane way of securing the rights without causing loss of life or property. The method of non-violent resistance have spread throughout the world since Gandhi's death. In 1952, Danilo Dolci used it to liberate the mafia-bound Sicily. In 1953, Lanza del Vasto directed it against the military takeover of poor farmers in Algeria. Penetration of non-violent resistance in the United States was amazing, given the deep entrenchment of violence and prejudice in that society. In the mid-1950s, non-violent protest campaigns came with increasing frequency. The best example of non-violent resistance is that waged by Martin Luther King in the late 1950s and early 60s. King was deeply inspired by the Gandhi's concept of non-violent resistance and used it to fight for the rights of the blacks and against segregation and discrimination. His march to Washington in 1963, when some 200,000 assembled, is one example of this approach. His famous speech, "I Have a Dream," was delivered at that congregation. And there are other examples which I won't go through, but there is example of solidarity movement in Poland, again a non-violent resistance which freed the country from oppression. In South Africa, the African National Congress under the leadership of Nelson Mandela successfully used it for a long period of time. Martin Luther King, of course, Lech Walesa and Nelson Mandela, they all are prime examples of what non-violence can do. Now what is interesting is, in each of these cases, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Walesa, after the oppressor had been thrown out, or the just aim had been realized, there was no bitterness left between the adversaries and the oppressor. In each of these cases, in all cases where violence has been used, the bitterness persists for a long period of time. But these are very good examples where people who were adversaries at the time remain friends after it. The British Commonwealth is an example of this type of situation. And finally, the question that comes is non-violence effective in national defense? When individual oppressors and oppressed is okay. You have civil disobedience, you have non-cooperation which works there. But what about nation-to-nation wars? And where there are these armaments of destruction available to them. Now, this is a little bit more complicated question, whether it will be successful under that situation. And this is mainly because the prevailing culture of violence in the society, and there is a reluctance among nations to try such a bold step. Nevertheless, there have been examples where such action has succeeded. And I'll give you one example which is very interesting. The most remarkable of these is the case of invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 by the combined forces of Soviet Union East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Taken by surprise and not expecting an invasion by the so-called allies, the Czech army offered no defense. However, the people offered non-violent resistance. Citizens blocked access of Soviet tanks to a bridge by forming a human chain. Water supply to the Soviet troops was blocked. Radio and television helped in organizing the people and providing information. The Czechoslovakian people removed signposts and street signs to misguide the invading armies. Thus, the entire military might of Soviet army was not able to subjugate Czechoslovakia. This is one successful example. Now, in recent years, there has been a resurgence of interest in using civil defense as a strategy to fight national wars or to satisfy national wars. And there has been a lot of research. Jean Sharp was a professor at University of Massachusetts. He's written a 3-volume book on how you can use non-violent as a social defense, as a national defense. So there is interest in it. It's not been used really extensively, except for a few examples that I gave you. So that studies on social science have been carried out in the United States and several countries of Europe, Great Britain, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Holland, Finland, Australia, and Denmark. There is not yet, however, a carefully designed and implemented social defense strategy, other than in the books, as I mentioned, one book, Jean Sharp's book on non-violence, 3-volume book. He charts out what course of action it might take in defending a nation non-violently from invasion by another nation. I covered my part, before questions be answered, and we'll talk about it later on, but I'll request Manvitha to talk about protection of the environment.
Thank you for that. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here on such a lovely afternoon when you have so many other outdoor options to talk about Gandhi and his relevance today. Thank you, Humarji, for walking us through some of Gandhi's most important principles and doing such a thorough job, and to Professor Rao for such a generous introduction. Thank you. If you haven't had a chance to meet Professor Humar or Professor Rao yet, I would highly recommend that you do. They have been my mentors, even though I've only known Professor Rao for a week now. It's every interaction I've had with each of them, I've come away a better person. So I would want you to have that too. So don't be shy, introduce yourself, have a conversation, they're fantastic. I would like to begin my presentation by acknowledging that we are on unceded Algonquin territory. What does it mean? What does it mean to acknowledge land? And there are several things this could mean for several people. But for me and my journey as a guest in Ottawa, it has come to mean at this moment that we need to recognize that there were peoples, ways of life, worldviews, practices, festivals, rituals that existed for tens of thousands of years before we came to live on these lands called Ottawa. And through processes of violence, through processes of injustice, have been either eradicated or completely and irreversibly modified. So I think partly what a land acknowledgement does is to give us pause, to reflect on these processes, and also maybe to educate ourselves, to say, well, who are these Algonquin peoples? How do they live now? Where do they live now? What is their current state? What is their history, right? So there is an interesting website called tanakiwin.com, and it's called the Algonquin Peoples of Ontario website. And they have both historical, cultural, and current statistics and narratives about who the Algonquin peoples are and how they live today in all of Ontario. So I would encourage you to go look it up. And I think it's more relevant to acknowledge land when talking about Gandhi's ecological view, because this ethic of ahimsa, satyagraha, decolonization is deeply tied in with living off the land, with living in harmony with our non-human actors and entities. And that's what I hope to show, that Gandhi's ecological view is so closely tied in with indigenous people's beliefs about the land, So it's hard to really detangle or make distinct this idea of decolonization or the idea of an ecological ethic. So as Professor Rao mentioned, the title of my talk is The Relevance of Gandhi's Environmentalism in the 21st Century. And I want to talk about Gandhi's environmentalism for two main reasons. The first is that, along with nuclear threat, I think environmental crises are what define our living civilization at the moment. The UN and other agencies working on such issues have changed their language in the ways in which we describe these processes. So it's not global climate change, it's climate crisis, it's climate emergency. It's not global warming, it's global heating, because they believe that the language needs to reflect the reality of what is happening out there. And the politics of holding information back in relation to climate change is also something that's now being debated. And in India, in the past 30 years, over 200,000 farmers have committed suicide. So that's over 10 farmers in the entire country every single day. And these are all deaths due to environmental change. So I think it's fair to say, both in terms for India and globally, we are in a crisis. It is climate crisis, so we need to start talking about what we can do about that. I think it's also interesting to talk about Gandhi's environmentalism, because when one thinks about Gandhi or when one thinks about Gandhi's policies and principles, one doesn't immediately think of environmentalism, right? One thinks of non-violence, conflict resolution, satyagraha, satya, ahimsa. But really at the root of Gandhi's life and living was this deep-rooted ecological view to live in harmony and as much as possible in complete peace with all of his environment that he interacted with. So that's really what I'd like to focus on today. And there's also some controversy about his environmentalism, right? Because there are some scholars globally and both in India who claim that, of course not, Gandhi is not an environmental thinker. There is no idea about pollution or reversing climate change. Well, of course not. That's not the language in which he wrote or spoke or lived, right? So what we're really going to look at today is his ecological view, which I think goes beyond conservation and really talks about coexistence. There are another bunch of people, and Professor Humar mentioned Jean Sharp, who have actually dedicated their entire lives to both theorizing about, so publishing and writing and talking about, but also living their lives in accordance with Gandhi's ecological views. So globally speaking, there's, and nationally speaking, in Canada, there's Professor Alfred Tayake, who also gave the annual lecture last year at the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council, who brings ideas of Gandhian colonization together and talks about his ecological views and their relevance to the Mohawk nations in the western coast, in BC. There's Arne Naines, who's a Norwegian philosopher. He was a professor of philosophy, gave that up in 1970, and then dedicated his entire life to living an ecological view. And he gave the world this idea of deep ecology, what it means to live in nature as nature. There's also Jean Sharp, that Professor Humar mentioned, who founded the Albert Einstein Institution, which promotes the study and practice of non-violent action throughout the globe. And there's Lawrence Baker, who's an architect, who's a British-born Indian architect, who's built many office, residential, and museum buildings completely in an ecological and sustainable fashion. So ruled by the principles of Ahimsa and Satya, and what that looks like in architecture. So you should Google some of his creations, they're fantastic. In India itself, Gandhi has had a huge influence on the environmental movement. So Ramachandra Guha, an Indian historian, and for the past 20 years has been writing about environmental issues, has actually called Gandhi the single most important influence on the environmental movement. There's Vandana Shiva, who started Navadanya on completely Satyagraha's principles. There's Sundarlal Bahuguna and Chandi Prasad Bhatt, who started the Chipko Movement. And Medha Patkar and Baba Ante, that you might be more familiar with, who started the Narmada Bachao Andolan, right? So helping both the river Narmada as well as those who were displaced by construction of dams on the Narmada. So what is Gandhi's ecological view that has so much global and Indian and Canadian appeal, right? So at the heart of Gandhi's ecological view is really the idea that humans and non-humans, so animals and sentient and other non-sentient beings, should live in coexistence. It is an attitude of coexistence. So humans are not the owners, they are not the masters of nature, but they are a part of nature. They are one being amongst other beings in nature. What does that mean? What does it mean to live like that? And this quote comes to mind. Gandhiji has written, he says, "To my mind, the life of a lamb is no less precious than that of a human being. I should be unwilling to take the life of a lamb for the sake of the human body. I hold that the more helpless a creature, the more entitled it is to protection by man from cruelty of man." I think it makes us flip our view of really what nature is and think about what responsibilities we have as humans towards nature. Part of what it means to live in this ecocentric way is to also allow nature to take its course. Well, of course, rivers flow in a certain way, volcanoes erupt when they want, there's little we can do about that. But I think as humans, we also have a realm of responsibility in order to not cause any unnecessary interference in the course of nature. So there's an interesting anecdote about this. So Gandhi, of course, had an ashram. And he had a little room in the ashram where he would mainly use for correspondence. So most of the essays, books, and letters he's written, he wrote from that room. So occasionally a cobra would enter, occasionally. And there were strict instructions to everybody in the ashram to not harm the cobra in any way. So you're not supposed to hit it, you're not supposed to shoo it away. So Gandhi's point was that if that cobra wants to come crawling into my room, I've chosen this as my room. And that cobra has an equal right to coexist in this land, which was its before I constructed the ashram here. So that's really, I think, what coexistence means. And he says, I do not want to live at the cost of the life of even a snake. So that's what it means to really change that perspective, right? Gandhi was also very influenced by nature. He thought we should take examples from nature and try to be like nature as much as possible. So just in the way that nature provides life and sustenance and support and love and encouragement to all its creatures, mighty and small, in the same way, Gandhi tried to emulate that behavior in the ways in which he interacted with other people. So at his ashram, he received all kinds of world leaders, like radio analysts and TV show hosts, but he also received peasants and people who were having trouble with their farmland or waterways. And he gave each of them equal importance because he said, I want to be like nature. I want to be able to interact with both the mighty and the small with equal significance. And here's an interesting quote about his view on ecology. I venture to suggest that it is the fundamental law of nature, without exception, that nature produces enough for our wants from day to day, and if only everybody took enough for himself and nothing more, there would be no pauperism in this world, there would be no man dying of starvation in this world. And that really goes to the heart of his critique of modern Western civilization, that there is enough for every man's need, but there isn't enough for everyone's greed. So that's something to keep in mind. So Gandhi's ecological view basically brings all his principles together. So whether that's Ahimsa, Satya, Sarvodaya, Swadeshi, Swaraj, the critique of modern Western civilization, what it means to do that, and Satya as well. So I will briefly look at the principles of Ahimsa and Satya and talk about how they've played a huge role in the narrative of animal rights in the USA, and then talk about its effect on India as well. So Gandhi's principle of Ahimsa can be understood in two ways. Ahimsa is usually translated as non-violence. So as non-violence, one is abstaining from presenting any form of unnecessary violence to any beings. And Gandhi believed that it wasn't just humans against whom we can act in a violent way. There are also species of all kinds against whom we should not be violent. So Ahimsa, when understood as non-violence, is basically an abstinence from any kinds of unnecessary violence. And this is illustrated in what he said about the land, trying to coexist, in what he said about the cobra, trying to coexist. There's another interesting story about non-violence to even things, right? So Gandhi was at a political meeting, and Miraben, who would often travel with him and assist him in these meetings, was preparing for his meeting. So one of her tasks is usually in the morning to sharpen all his pencils that he would use for note-taking. So Gandhiji's papers were there, the pencil was placed next to the papers. Gandhiji came and sat down, and he looks at the pencil and he said, "The person who sharpened this pencil was angry when they did it." So then he was in the meeting, he did all his, speeches. And he goes to Miraben and he asks, "Did you sharpen my pencil this morning?" And she says, "Yes, Gandhiji." "Were you angry this morning?" "Yes, Gandhiji." And he says to her, "Next time you are angry, can you please not sharpen my pencil? Because it shows on the pencil and that distresses me." And I think that's really what we need to take away from the scope of Ahimsa, from the scope of non-violence, right? That it really extends beyond my family, my friends, my neighbors, but to all species and things. So these kinds of ideas about Ahimsa greatly struck a young philosopher at the time called Tom Regan in the United States, who is, I think, globally iconic for the movements he started both in the US as well as across the globe for animal rights. He said animals, just like people, should have rights. They should not be harmed against, they should not be violated against. It's also interesting to note, so when you, there's this one point though that I want to go back to, is that given the scope of non-violence to both human and non-human things, Gandhi also recognized that it does take violence to live. For humans to exist, for order to exist, for structure in society to exist, he does recognize that it takes some amount of violence. So he was in correspondence with a sage in Gujarat who was having trouble with stray dogs. And at one point the trouble got so intense that he had to euthanize the dogs. And there was a huge hue and cry against this because Gandhiji had initially advised against it, but then received news that this had to be done. There was no way around it. So this is what he issued to that public outcry, and as a response to Seiji. He said, "Roving dogs, particularly a swarm of them, are a menace to society. The multiplication of them is quite unnecessary, and those who now counsel their protection on grounds of religion, even at the cost to life and safety of humans, are to be reminded that to practice the religion of humanity requires also the recognition that we offend against dogs as a class by suffering them to stray and to live on crumbs or savings from our plates that we throw at them, and we injure our neighbors also by doing so." So Gandhiji rejected this idea of Ahimsa as unnecessary violence, but retained the realization that it takes some kind of structural violence in order to exist. Merely taking life is not always Himsa. One may even say that there is sometimes more Himsa in not taking life. So that's a unique kind of Gandhi that we don't always get to hear about, right? So I thought it's interesting to sort of contextualize his idea of minimal violence, what it takes to survive and live, in this idea of ecological view. The other side of Ahimsa, so one side is non-violence, the other side is Satya, or truth. And at different times of Gandhi's life, truth has come to mean different things. But really, the one constant meaning of truth is that this world, this entire planet and all of existence has been created by God. And that all creatures have a right to exist within it and inside it, not merely as things we own. Right? So it's interesting. Once I am able to love all of creation, that also motivates me to approach others, non-human and human others, with compassion, with love. That provides the motivation. So Satya as Ahimsa and Satya as love should be seen as two sides of the same coin. It's the same principle that holds it together. And Satya is also the core of the biocentric view or the ecological view that Gandhi is putting forth, right? That all of creation matters. So Tom Regan had lots in common with Gandhiji. They were both vegetarians. They both converted to vegetarian at some point in their lives. And they were also both against vivisection, harming animals for the use of research and scientific purposes. So vivisection is a special case where operations are performed on non-human animals when they are still living in order to see how medication works or how that procedure works. And it's an interesting story how Tom Regan came to read Gandhi. He was a young professor in philosophy, teaching moral thought, what is right action, what is good thought. And then the Vietnam War broke out. And then he realized there are people dying. And here I'm just theorizing about these moral values. How can I be more engaged? And he says, I have never been an energetic reader, except in the case of Gandhi. I read him with enormous energy and dedication. I think it is fair to say that I would have never become an animal rights advocate if I had not read Gandhi's autobiography, right? So it's interesting, there is one speech called the greatest animal rights speech ever given in 1988 that Tom Regan gave at a rally. And he says this: we are gathered here today to declare war on vivisection. Our shared goal is not to reform this great evil, but to abolish it completely. It is not bigger cages we want, but empty cages. Anything less than total victory will not satisfy us. This call to arms, this declaration of war, is not a call to violence. It is a call to peace. The use of violence will never really change anything. Morally, violence is indefensible. Tactically, it is unwise. No, the means we must use to wage our war are those shaped and proven by Gandhi, the weapons of non-violence. So it's really this kind of belief and practice and philosophy that drove Tom Regan to have advocated for animal rights in the USA for over 50 years. He had a 70-year-long career, and 50 years he dedicated to supporting animal rights. So bringing things home a little, for those of us who still call India home, Satyagraha and non-violence, the practice of non-violence, has had a huge positive impact in the ways in which environmentally people have been able to make positive interventions in India. So the main methodology in Satyagraha basically brings together principles and virtues of Satya, so truth, non-violence, courage, and civil disobedience, non-cooperation, and the principles of Swaraj and Swadeshi. And what's also important to Satyagraha is that it is a means that is used to protest against an unjust law, that one recognizes that there's some form of moral or legal or constitutional injustice, and that's what Satyagraha is a response to. And there are two examples I'd like to share with you. The first is the Chipko Movement in India, which was started formally in the 1970s. But there was a need for it from the late 50s to the early 60s. So the early 60s is when people in the Garhwali Himalayas, the lower Himalayas in the mountains, both indigenous and non-indigenous populations, started finding it difficult to continue living off of their land and off the forest due to major and massive logging. And so even though their ways of life were indigenous, they still lived under colonial law, where it was possible for the government of India, so the forest department, to cordon off chunks of forest to contract out for logging purposes. So in order to protest this kind of logging, they formed a cooperation called the DGSS, the Dasholi Gram Swarajya Sangh, or the Dasholi Society for Village Self-Rule. And they started trying to imbibe and practice self-reliance and economic self-reliance and sustainability by trying to make enough just for their communities. So in 1974, they basically had a little, an interesting encounter with the Department of Forestry, and that's when the Chipko movement started, because they asked to basically have access to 300 trees for their own sustenance, whereas a contracting company called Simon Company got access to 3,000 trees. So that's what they were trying to protest. And this Chipko movement involved men and women mostly, hugging trees, Chipko, to attach, to stick with, right? So it basically meant hugging a tree, which prevented bulldozers from logging those trees. So that's how, by putting themselves between the trees and the machinery, they were able to protect their land. The other very important movement that is continuing today is through Vandana Shiva's Navadanya. So Navadanya is an organization that Vandana Shiva started in India more than 25 years ago. And Vandana Shiva is a physicist by training, an ecologist by passion, and a feminist by inheritance. I think that's the best way to describe her. And she basically started the Satyagraha movement within the agricultural industry. So she has movements called Bean Satyagraha, which means seed Satyagraha, or Tel Satyagraha, oil Satyagraha, or water Satyagraha, that's Jal Satyagraha. Basically launching peaceful protests against huge corporations like Monsanto, the World Bank, Suez, the government of India, to prevent, say, privatization of water, to prevent local communities from making their own self-sustainable oil, to prevent Monsanto from entering the Indian market, to force upon these farmers monoculture crops, and the ways in which that has actually now leading to increased suicide rates. So it's interesting to see how Navadanya brings together ideas of Swaraj, so self-rule, self-independence, gaining freedom through peace and non-violence. I would just like to end with a quote that brings together, I think, the important points that Professor Humar was making about security threat and what it means to take the ecology seriously. Because when Vandana Shiva was asked about why she prefers non-violence to violence, this is what she said. Unfortunately, crude means of dealing with violence and terror just breed more violence and terror. As we saw after 9/11, the war on terror has created more terrorists. I think anyone who says that Gandhi is irrelevant in today's world doesn't understand either terrorism, its roots, or Gandhi. Suicide bombers don't get created out of the blue. They are created as a result of decisions, systems, and processes. It's very much like weeds in a field. One way to control weeds is by spraying Roundup. But then you get Roundup resistant weeds, which are even stronger than the original weeds. That's what is happening with terrorism. Or you can do mixed cultivation, where the partnership among the plants controls the weeds by managing the sun in the right way and the moisture in the right way. Organic weed control is totally successful without using violence. The same happens with terrorism. We need to build the levels and kinds of relationships that allow communities to feel as one. And I'll just conclude, I'll leave you with this one thought. What does it mean? What does it mean to really put into action this biocentric or ecological view that Gandhi has propounded? It's messy, because we have our own ideas of progress. We have a certain technological use that wasn't the case 100, 200, or 10,000 years ago. So what does it mean to balance this idea of coexistence with nature as well as be true to our idea of what we call progress? But I think what the biocentric view does, what the ecological view does, is helps us focus on the right kinds of questions. So it helps us make that flip, make that switch from asking what are the best ways in which I can efficiently make use of this nature, to asking what is the cost, what are the means of my coexistence with nature, and what are the costs of that coexistence, which has to be measured in both human and non-human ways. And I think empathy, really putting into practice that principle of empathy, extending our concern, self-concern, outside of our parents, our families, our neighbors, our kinship, slowly to reach even a pencil. I think that's really what we're looking at here. And that, I think, is our responsibility as humans in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Manvitha, for an erudite, up to the day working of Gandhian philosophy in the environmental field, incidentally touching all life itself. Thank you, Professor Humar, for your wonderful presentation. For the sake of the audience, I will simply highlight in 1 minute. Professor Humar highlighted how Gandhi would be very concerned today about resource destruction, impractical tacticians, continued violence on a global scale, the lack of pursuit of truth force. Truth is the greatest calamity today, as we all know, particularly with the internet, Facebook, Google, and all that. It is the rarest commodity, and it takes hell of a lot of work for each one to find out what the real truth is about anything. Professor Humar also highlighted that violence is no solution. But there is one saving grace. There is the universal appeal of non-violence. And I thought the best point that you really hit upon as the essence of Gandhian philosophy was that spiritual evolution that is demanded of each one of us, so that we will not be bitter even in the face of violence thrown at us. That bitterness is an average human quality. But the spiritual evolution of all societies, that was the concern of Gandhiji. So he asked every individual to progress on his spiritual journey. Gandhi himself was a very average man when he was young, like Saint Augustine, very average man. But we don't remember about Saint Augustine today, all the sins he committed when he was young. So I'm not concerned about all the blunders that Gandhiji made when he was young. But he reached the pinnacle of spiritual evolution when he saw there is no distinction between the living and the non-living. When I was young, I read a quote from Gandhiji, "There is life in a rock." I said, he is a fool. But it took me a lot of growth for myself to know who the real fool was. So, Manvitha highlighted living in harmony, not merely with the land, but with everything around you. And what was Gandhiji's principle or secret formula for this? In your own mind, you must think pure. Your thoughts must be moral. Your actions must be moral, matched by your moral thought. And the consequences will be equally moral. That is the central philosophy of Gandhi. Every individual must, in thought, kind and deed, must be moral. It applies to the land, it applies to politics, it applies to social development. And that is why he said, he had this principle of trusteeship. That is, don't take more than you need. Don't be greedy. So he would be opposed to the consumerism of today. I mean, where needs are created by the ad agencies, where there are no needs. And this is the essence. And he tested this in India with what is called the moral evolution of the Indians. Let me see. He started what is called the donation of land. Vinoba Bhave, as you all might be knowing, pursued this. Millions of hectares of land were given up as donation based on Gandhian principle of not taking too much. And this is very interesting experiment. How many of us are willing to really give up what we have? Where is the limit? So this is the most interesting presentation, and I'm personally as a moderator, I have been enlightened from the presentations of both of you, and I shall open the floor for questions. Please be brief so that the panelists, if you can, name the panelists, but they will be free to answer and so on. So, okay? Please, I welcome questions now from the floor. Dr. Neil.
I'll ask a question. By the way, there are still people around here who have seen him in the flesh. But that's not the question. I have a question for Dr. Humar and a question for Manvitha. The question for Dr. Humar is this. Why have Gandhiji's ideas essentially been ignored or rejected in India after his assassination, with the exception of people like Vinoba Bhave? And the question for Manvitha is this. Can 9 billion people coexist in the world according to his view of life? 1 billion can, but can 9 billion do it?
Yeah, you're quite Dr. Miyabi. In India, much of what Gandhi preached is not being followed. Violence is, of course, still there. You know, in fact, Gandhi believed in development at the village level, not in a big industrial way. We still, Pandit Nehru was, of course, not in the same line of thinking. What has happened is, though, there are isolated instances where people are still following Gandhi's way. One of them was mentioned here, the Chipko, hugging a tree to protect a tree, or the Jai Jagat movement of Rajagopalan, who marches, big marches to preserve the rights of Adivasis, the Aboriginals, or the tribal people. He is in fact leading a march to Europe, to Geneva, coming year. And this is the march which takes place over a period of time through 40 countries or so. So there are people who are still following, but yeah, you're quite right. On the whole, there is not the following that Gandhi would have liked, and that's the truth. Now that is because of various reasons. The morality is not there still in the way it should have been. And that's a degradation that has taken place probably all over the world with the type of culture we have, the type of intrinsic violence in the society that we have, the type of wants for more and more want, more greed, more profit.
Difference between 47 and 9.
Yeah, and that people have realized that modest living and self-restraints are important. In fact, 2 years ago, Pope Francis issued a communical which said that all people of the world should follow modesty in their living and their self-restraint. So you're right in a way. That's not being done in India this time, and that's something is desirable. In fact, it's desirable throughout the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think the good news is we're not at 9 billion yet. bad news is we're over 7 billion, right? So the idea is to what we can do before we reach that 9 billion, right? So the idea, there are a couple of things going on with Gandhi's philosophy, just generally, overall, but I think especially with his ecological view is that what can we do before we reach a crisis mode? Because the idea of going into crisis, that's not the point. The point is not to resolve crisis once it's there. The point is how do we live our lives so that we're not in crisis mode, right? And that's really an ethical approach. That's really what virtue ethics is working towards. And it's, one thing is that it's really hard to implement these principles because they're based on individual morality, right? So it's hard work. It's hard work, and I don't think our education system, I don't think our social system, and I don't think our political systems are geared towards compatibility with those kinds of virtues, right? But I think the best way forward would be, as Gandhi suggested, at the community level, at the village level, at the local level, to really have that sense of community and see what can be done for sustainability there. But I have to say, like in the past 2 decades, maybe about 10-15 years, a lot actually has been done globally in the ways in which indigenous peoples across the globe have moved towards ecological living. So the constitution in New Zealand now recognizes the Wanganui River as a person. Basically what that means is that people can take, on behalf of the river, they can go to court in order to protect the river. So the constitutions of Bolivia and Ecuador have earth right. Earth jurisprudence is the goal, is the epistemic lens through which their laws are made. So I think that perspectival shift is not completely absent. Even the Uttarakhand court last year in India passed laws that give personhood, legal personhood, to animals in order to prevent atrocities committed against them. So I'd like to say that there has been progress and that it's one step at a time.
I would like to say, you are right up to a point. Gandhiji's ideas have been enshrined in the directive principles of state policy in the Indian Constitution, which is an idealistic document. That is, all the aspirations of the nation have been codified in that. And the state is given the duty to work inch by inch, principle by principle, policy by policy to improve the condition of the Indian people. For example, K. Santanam, one of the great ministers in the past, commenting on Gandhi said, Gandhi's greatest service to the nation is the emancipation of Indian women. Now, all over the world there were protestations, violence in the Western societies, but all these old fellows in India gathered together and said, we are not going to go that path. We are going to go the path of non-violence. Why should women fight for their rights? It is their rights. We merely recognize. And so, that does not mean every woman is free. But theoretically, they have created the framework of freedom for women. Now, today, if Gandhi were alive, he would be happy that every village is electrified in many parts of India. And every village woman is cooking on a different technical basis than during his time. So there is progress, there is the Gandhian principle, but moving at a glacial pace, very slow. But that is to be expected when you're talking about billions of people. So there is some movement. Gandhi is not irrelevant, even in India, even today. If you analyze the political speeches of Modi, you will find he is paying some may say lip service. I don't think so, but you need the resources. And I think there is a movement in the right direction. That's my submission. Okay? Any other questions? Bala?
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure, honor, and privilege to thank the panelists and the moderator. As a token of appreciation, I'd like to give a gift for each one of you.
How about a big hand for the young lady with the leading light?
Thank you. This concludes the panel discussion. May you please join the main stage or the marine viewer.